There. Okay, we should be good.
Okay, so welcome everybody. So for those of you that are new here, we are Center for Book Arts. We were founded in 1974, so it is our 50th year anniversary this year, and we are the oldest nonprofit dedicated to uplifting and furthering the book arts and through education, preservation, exhibition, art making, and community building. Um, so today we're here as part of our Small Press Incubator program, which is an 8-week program dedicated to BIPOC writers and poets to help them create small presses, which our 4 participants are here today. But I'm not sure if we have a gallery view right now, but yes, we have our 4 participants here. We can highlight later on. But for now, we are going to be doing a lecture with Lindsay Buchman, who is a Brooklyn-based interdisciplinary artist, writer, and publisher whose work explores image making and writing through print media, lens-based media, and artist books. Buchman holds an MFA from the University of Pennsylvania and a BFA from California State University, Long Beach. As an extension of her practice, she runs Seaton Street Press, an independent artist books and publications project that examines the intersections of sight, language, and memory through archival histories, counter-narratives, social identities, and geographies. So yeah, today's lecture will be about distribution, and I'll let you take it away, Lindsay.
Thanks so much, Tyler. Okay, just confirming you can still hear me. Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks everyone in the press cohort. Really a pleasure to be with you. And hopefully this can be something that's practical for you. I will definitely be taking questions at the end. And I tried to structure this around central topics that I thought might be helpful. So some of those topics include the intentionally kind of faded away text that's in the background, thinking about distribution from the many aspects of what it means to distribute books, which takes on much more than just finding a place to sell them. So I'm going to go through like a range of different approaches, things that I think about, and kind of ground this in my practice a little bit. So Tyler, thank you so much for giving me the introduction. I will just say that my relationship to print media specifically comes from that background in traditional printmaking, and how I'm making artist books is often really informed by a tactility in bookmaking. Now I'm working at a scale which the sort of handmade quality is less visible, but that relationship is still really present for me. And so in terms of the publishing practice itself, I'm making artist books anywhere from short run, say like 50 copies up to 300 copies, predominantly in the larger run these days. The project that I run is called Seaton Street Press. It is based in Brooklyn now. It's been quite itinerant. It's moved around a lot in the past many years. It was rooted and grounded in Philadelphia for a long time, briefly upstate, and now in Bushwick in Brooklyn. The books that I make are really committed to the role of place and the specificity of location in shaping communities and belonging. So a lot of what I'm thinking about is how do people tell stories through books? And that really gets into what is the role of distributing people's stories? And there's a significant kind of responsibility, I'd say an ethical responsibility around how to get books into the right places. So that's something that I'll talk about a bit kind of later on. A lot of the work that I do in publishing is committed to Latina narratives and marginalized identities. So many of the projects involve people's family stories, their personal histories, their communities, and explored through topics like migration, gentrification, and familial archives. We publish projects that often involve writing and photography and trying to find this balance between how text and image can intersect. So sometimes that looks like oral histories, things that are nonlinear but have creative nonfiction elements, sometimes hybridized text, poetry, the confluence of those kind of text-based forms. And one of the things I want to say that I think is really important is that anytime you're getting into something new, especially because I'm here in a role as a mentor, is that the feedback that I'm giving you is just based on my personal experience, right? So what I do, it's specific to being a lens-based publisher, making artist books within that community. It is crucial, I think, for all of you to really define your communities and develop your own practices based on the communities you belong to, and understanding how to contextualize your work might look different than what I'm presenting today. So I'm just trying to give you kind of best practices based on my own experience of doing this for the past 6 years or so, and really emphasizing that authenticity is at the crux of everything we do. So if you're feeling like it's a lot, you all in the press cohort are like learning a lot of information fast, trust yourself, your intuition, and your own pace, right? So the pacing of how you make work is really critical to publishing because often we're working on tight timelines and the rest is going to be whatever it's going to be. And I think that's true of anything in life, but I think especially in publishing, there's always going to be urgencies, and it's really important to try to find your own mood and way that you go through that. Okay, so some of the topics I wanted to cover include these chapters. There's a range of topics that I want to go over. I'm going to focus really on just kind of laying out, like, how am I approaching this in my own publishing? But then what do you do with this information? So some of you are coming to publishing. Some of you, I know there's a range of people on the call. Some of you might already be publishers or making your own books, but I'm going to kind of treat this as like we begin with the making as a way to get to distribution. So distribution begins with making. I was thinking about this like you have to make the work, generate, prototype, experiment, try new approaches to book forms, and really think about what it is that you're trying to produce. You have to try, you're going to fail, you have to make something baseline. I'm showing you a range of images and documentation from projects that I've published and work that I have been focused on more recently in 2024. Livia's Like That is the first hardcover publication of my publishing practice. And this image, I wanted to start with like I would say like the highest end binding first to kind of move backwards and just say that when you're thinking about production of a project, and you're getting to distribution, you have to think about who is your community, who's your audience, who's your reader. And so everything that I'm doing as I'm conceptualizing works with other artists is kind of working through like, okay, who are we trying to inform? So in this particular book, these are process shots of the book in production. There's proofing and there's book spreads from it being in production and then collating and then making signatures to sew the book together. And in that process, the book scales up. And so that means distribution becomes much larger. It's edition 300. That means that books can distribute ideally in multiple continents. They can go into special collections. The goal is wide distribution. And so that's really important to pay attention to is like, what is the number of an edition size? And then also means of production, which I'll sort of get into a little bit later. But in terms of just pointing this out in this project, those are some of the things I'm thinking about. And I wanted to show a contrast to that, which is the first publication I ever made in 2015. I made this while I was in graduate school, and it is about Los Angeles, where I was based prior to being on the East Coast for a long time. And the book is in pieces, and I think this is always important, like looking at artists archiving and also just naming conventions, right? Like you need to be good at file management to manage projects. And I wanted to point this out as like this is the first book I ever made. So first image, page, title version 2, variation, lighter, new, darkest. It's like so haphazard in terms of its file conventions, and something that I'm not doing anymore as I've been doing this a long time and is not practical to staying organized. But this idea that distribution for a book like this, if you look at the edition number, was edition 30. And at that small of a scale, it's probably not going to be an issue that my titles and my naming conventions of files were a little all over the place, right? It's an edition of 30. I ran second edition on it, or second printing technically. And so it's been printed a few times at edition 30. And when I first was publishing, I was making everything in the scale of 30 copies. And that was a feasible and practical way for me to publish because one, financially, I could afford to do it. Two, it wasn't that much labor. And three, I didn't have that many places to give the books away or sell them. So at that time, that was practical. And I'd say when you're first starting to make a publishing practice, smaller scale edition numbers probably make sense. There are obviously publishers working at much larger scales than myself. And then I wanted to include just an image studio from that time, 2016, where I started making books. I was in grad school at the time. And a lot of these moments of documentation and trying to make photographs and basically have someone assist where they're holding down a page. And I was making these oversized books at the time and trying to work through like, okay, how do you document this? And then how do you change it in post-production with Photoshop to make it something that is more magical? So when I went through all my old archive images, my phone, my camera roll is like filled with these photos of me standing on chairs in all different orientations and with random people's hands, friends. and just trying to document what was being done, which I think I'm going to talk about documentation in a second. And I think it's a really important aspect of when we distribute, we need to be taking some form of documentation of the work that we're making, because part of distribution is being able to share it and seeking people to either distribute or to purchase, et cetera. So that image on the left is sort of where this began. I am not standing on chairs as much these days. Often I am hiring friends to photograph for me, which has helped significantly. The image on the right is a former studio when I was based in Hudson of the risograph, which is one of the primary tools that I print on, as well as a lot of proofs, and then still kind of working towards this larger scale edition. So the second note that I have in here is that distribution begins with documentation. And that is whatever form you can get. So photographing, filming, like making videos, scanning, whatever else you've come up with, document in whatever way is accessible to you, but make sure that you get documentation. And that becomes important for all kinds of things. So I have just a few images in here that are from documentation of an exhibition that some of this work I've published was in at Solmendic Project Space, the former University of the Arts, which recently closed in Philadelphia. And this was documented by Hagen G. Pearson. So I do often hire friends and work with people or work trade with people to get access to things. And I would say, if you have exhibitions or events that your books are at, it's really nice to have exhibition imagery. And that helps build relationships and sharing that and promoting your work. And then these images are by Christina Levy, who works for Conveyor Studio and is a co-founder there. And the documentation of Magli's book, La Vie is Like That. So Magli Duzant was the artist who I had in previous images. This book documents in a way where you can really get a sense of its physicality. It's small in scale. I'm thinking about light quality, how much the saturation shows what is actually in the book. And then also didactics, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but finding language to describe a project becomes equally as important. So you can make the work, but then how are you going to talk about it? And where are you going to send that information to? It helps if you know what the project is. And in the process of making books, if you are physically making them and working on layout, you become intimately aware of what a project is about. So in this case, then pulling writing from a project becomes easy. It's secondhand. And you will end up just knowing your work that well, or work that you might be making with another person. So some other images from this publication include all of these spreads. And something we were looking to do, with distribution in mind, was get a range of images that showed full bleed spreads where the image goes across both pages, or pages where there is text. It's a text and image book. The project sort of walks through a wide-reaching narrative in which the artist is describing time and memory and loss and forgetting as her father was losing memory with dementia, and then also at the same time she was migrated to a new country. And so this relationship of time in the writing and the image making and the pacing becomes important to telling the story of the book. So the documentation as a strategy in distribution becomes, how can we give the right amount of images to tell that story? And then pairing that, if I go back one, pairing that with language that sort of points out there are things like humor, there are things that are fun and accessible, there's also philosophy. It does all of these things at once. And how can we sort of succinctly describe that and visualize it? Another project that I worked on this year was with Diana Guerra, Fleeting Under Light. And this project is also risograph project, they both are. And thinking through this one was very difficult to do documentation for, but so important to distribution, as the book is currently traveling for a Latin American exhibition in Europe. And part of having good documentation was the relationship with the curators of that project meant that they had access to the press release. They had all this information about the work. They saw it online, which a lot of times is how people are going to first encounter your work. So this project I scanned, and I kind of want to point that out as a difference to say that I don't always photograph. Sometimes I scan, and scanning can flatten the depth and dimension of the imagery. And in this work, it's all about migration as well. As I mentioned before, a lot of the work I'm publishing on involves migration. And so this loss of identity, leaving one's homeland and coming to another place. So the artist is from Peru and came to the US, and this forming of new identity, and then how that shifting of position and kind of memory is depicted through imagery and through textures and through paper type and the layout. And there's lots of little details in this book that speak to that story. So how to then best document, scanning made sense because photographing something that's perfect bound is very difficult to do. So you also have to deal and contend with like, okay, I do need the documentation. It's going to impact where this can go. What is the form that works for the book object? So these are the things, like this is after we've made a thing, you know, it's like now how do we photograph it or how do we tell the story about it? This is a fold out spread from this book. So it's a component that folds out on the right side, a longer image, and then paired with text on the other side. And then I have one more in here that is from Alcaide Ramirez, which I am currently working on. And it is Anaheim Boulevard, Hood to Suburb. It's about gentrification in Orange County, California. It's a project that's an accordion. It's a pre-order, which I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of pre-order later. But essentially this project, it's still in production. It's a more precious object. And so something to note is it's also edition 30. So kind of thinking back to that early LA book that I was talking about, I was like, edition 30 can make sense in some context. This is a special edition. It's being collected by libraries. It costs more money. It's meant to be a unique object. And then we will produce a more accessible, like $30 book object that is really meant for the community and intended to continue to tell the same story, but not costing, you know, $125. So these kinds of considerations for distribution also matter. Where is the book accessible? Who is the community that can afford it? And when you make a book that's expensive, you have to make the assumption that your distribution model is not intended for general access. So the press that I founded is really committed to accessibility from a price point, influenced by the history of artist books and publishing that comes out of printed matter. And so generally as a publisher, I don't want books to be that expensive, but on certain occasions when we can strategize, that might make sense. In this project, storytelling is depicted through oral history. There's writing, it's a 7-foot accordion, so the book folds out and there's text and image. It's like looking at a street, Anaheim Boulevard, where the artist grew up, from front and back side. And then the oral history is sort of written over in hand notation. Okay, so you make a book, you document a book, so it exists in some form, but then what do you do with it? And I was trying to think about like, what are the things that are invisible to someone who's doing this? So things like edition size, materials, expenses. What does that look like if you're coming unfamiliar to this world? Dreams times money equals variables because you're never going to be able to make everything that you want to make. And so you have to make compromises. So this is I had a studio in my home for a bit in Hudson. And so this is just a photo of the living space, like completely taken over by books and materials and risograph stuff and just my entire life, which is books these days. So I think if you are trying to work through this, like where are you going to make this project, whatever the project is that you're making? Logistics times edition size, that means like your logistics are going to condition your edition size. So you can't just make the largest edition you ever wanted to make, likely because it costs too much money, which I think is the challenge most of us face as small publishers. So how do you get your money? That would be secondary. What are the materials that you're using? What labor trades or access can you work out institutionally or through collaboration? So some of the things that I wanted to highlight in that are logistics and edition size. You want to determine the cost of things like paper based on edition size. So a lot of what we're doing when we're kind of working through like, what is the ultimate goal? If my goal is to make an edition of 500 because I want international distribution and I want to seek someone to distribute it, let's just say in another continent, and it's not going to be something I can manage, maybe I want edition size 300 at bare minimum. And based on that, if I have 100 pages in my book and let's say that I'm printing it, I have to account for overage, which is like proofing and extra copies because they won't all make it. Maybe I'm printing 10% overage of an edition of 100 pages at 300, which puts you at 3,300. So that's a lot of paper. And how much does that paper cost? And you just do the quick math and you're like, there's no way I can't make that edition that large because I can't afford that paper. So what you have to work through is like, are you doing the production or are you hiring a printer? If you're hiring a printer, they're going to have a whole other different list of costs. And honestly, most printers are going to be expensive because it's expensive to print and things cost money. So a lot of times what happens in small presses is that people are trying to work through like, okay, did I get a LaserJet printer? And or do I have access to a facility where I can use that kind of a printer to make a publication? And then considering how widely you want something distributed, you're going to like work backwards from that math to figure out what it is that you're trying to make. But I think something that happens, when you're first starting making publications, you're not always thinking about what it is that you're doing. Like when I started making publications, I made everything in edition of 30. I don't remember why. It wasn't like a specific reason. I just stuck with it. And once I did one, then I did all of them in 30. So there's like 5 different series of books that were edition 30. Anymore, I don't follow those conventions. I'm thinking about the logistics of what I'm doing to determine the output. Like what can I afford? And then how many books am I trying to make? And where am I hoping those books might go? Money aspect of this. I feel like this is the conversation no one ever wants to have that's really important for publishers and for artists in general. Like, how do you finance your project? Where are you getting your money from? Grants, fundraising, or day jobs fund most small scale presses, maybe a combination of those things. And funding directly affects how widely something can distribute. And I think that isn't acknowledged enough. Something that is a great model for funding something, if you want to work at a larger scale, could be doing pre-order or pre-sale to fund a book upfront where you get money for whatever the materials are that you need, the labor that you need, and then you have access to funding without going into debt. And then ideally you have that within an X amount of time, and then you can produce the project and you mail out once you have that met. Things like materials, source materials and determine how you'll move through production. That's really just a note to say sourcing materials is a whole art of its own. And something that you learn quickly when you're doing this kind of work is like, where can you even get the things you need? And can you get a wholesale rate somewhere? Because that's going to automatically make logistics easier. It's going to cut down on your expenses. So there's all kinds of things that people do. Honestly, collaboration, like sharing resources with friends who are in similar work, is probably the best way to kind of navigate this when you're beginning. And if you can gain access to any kind of institutional, like I know G talked about it last night in the other lecture, just institutional access is so much easier to make artwork. And so however that looks for you, like if you have any of those relationships, is to just try to call friends and ask for help, and don't be afraid to ask for help, and trade, like trade your labor with whatever skills you have. Okay, so another main topic here. A lot of times people are thinking about making artwork and they may think they want a publisher. And as a publisher, I can say like, it's great to have a publisher, but there's drawbacks as well. And so I want to kind of walk through some of the things that change between self-publishing versus having a publisher, and also rights to your work, which I think is key in terms of just maintaining, understanding like what your rights are and your agency. So I have an image on here that's from Printed Matter. If you are not familiar with Printed Matter, I highly recommend just checking out their catalog and take a note. I know it might be a little hard to see, but there's this number here. It's like 38,000 plus items from about almost 40,000 publishers. That is such a significant number of publishers, and over 47,000 artists, right? So it's a lot that's in the archive there. Catalog, not even archive, but it's work that can be purchased, and they are a place you can do either consignment or wholesale selling to. So some things to think about. If you're going to self-publish, you sell to stockists. That's how you would sell your work. That's one of the primary ways that you sell your work. Stockists include bookshops, places like sometimes galleries, places that want to purchase artist books or books of some sort that are within small press communities. And they're going to either purchase them upfront wholesale, or they're going to put them on consignment, meaning that you're not paid right away. You're paid either quarterly or later, or sometimes never. We can talk about the ethics of that later. But it means that you are directly dealing with the money aspect of how your work is distributing through stocking with booksellers. Self-publishing involves self-funding. as its name implies. You will have to figure out how to fund your projects. You would likely want to apply to book fairs because that's a central source of income for selling artist books or for making small press publications. It gives you access to community, but it also gives you access to selling a book and then seeing the proceeds of that pretty directly. So that's more of like a one-to-one relationship. You do have to pay a fee. It's usually quite nominal to attend a book fair, but that fee is the only cost associated. You retain full rights to your artwork when you self-publish. So for those of you thinking about copyright or royalties or anything involving like the rights to your work, self-publishing involves a lot of agency in maintaining the rights to your work. You also get to publish your projects when you're ready. And I want to stress this one because something that happens is like people think working with publishers is going to be the best thing ever. There's so much I think desire in like, especially in photo book communities, to work with publishers, but it doesn't mean that it's always the most pleasant experience unless you have a really good relationship, like working relationship with your publisher. I think that there are very few small presses who are publishing ethically where you can really maintain that like sort of fluidity in relationship, right? A lot of times it's like projects get pushed, deadlines get pushed back, which is totally normal, but you just might not like the feeling of not having agency over your work. And so that aspect of publishing when you're ready can give you a lot of self-empowerment to be like, okay, my project's done. I'm going to make this book. I figured out how to get the funding. I'm making 50 copies. And then you just go to print. And there is something about that that is really empowering. I'm saying that also as someone who has worked with publishers and who is a publisher. And, you know, generally, even as I'm thinking about working on larger projects, I'm like, well, do I really want to deal with what it would mean to work with a publisher? Because I know some of the drawbacks that come with that. It is more DIY, but it does afford that personal agency. So I think it's just a question of like, maybe some of your projects you want to self-publish and some you want a publisher for, or maybe you want to start your own press, which is the goal of a lot of what we're doing in this small press cohort. And so thinking through that means that not only are you kind of working through the self-publishing model, you're also thinking about starting an imprint, a press, and you're having to then deal with the published side of things. So if we look at the like lower list here, a publisher manages distribution. So if you start a press, like you also then become responsible for managing the distribution of your publications, which is a large responsibility as you have more artists that you might be collaborating with. You get to set your own pace and work at your own speed, but it definitely is a huge commitment to take on distribution. A publisher also, I have this note on here, should fund projects. It's not ideal to have to pay for your work to be published by a publisher, right? Like it's one thing if you're self-funding because you're paying to have your work made and it's you self-funding as a self-published project, or if you run your own press and you're funding, like, okay, all still like on the up and up. But publishers who are literally profiteering off of artists and exploiting artists, I would highly recommend not seeking a publisher if that's the model. There's very few cases in which I think it would make sense to pay money to a publisher to distribute your work. And there's all kinds of ethical concerns around that, but it is a common reality. Publishers do have access to institutions. So sometimes artists make choices where they're like, well, for distribution, I want this relationship that the publisher has. It's worth it to me. And I know that my work's going to be widely distributed. So I'm going to say like, it's okay that that's the case. So that could be like an exception to that rule. A publisher works on their own timeline. So anticipate that your project could get moved in terms of its publication date. It might not be up to you. And that will affect public programming and things like signings and launches and things like that, also distribution related. You have less agency in the process, but you could benefit substantially from platforms, right, and affiliations that a publisher might have. It's a question mark around the rights to your artwork. Generally, artists retain the copyright to all their work when it's published, but it just brings up other questions of like, what do royalties look like? Do you get to see an amount paid back to you after a book has been made if it's selling? What is the contract that is involved with the publisher? And those of you who are planning to start your own presses, I would really recommend trying to build like general language around how you collaborate with others, so that as you take on larger work, that you have like baseline foundation for how you're communicating with collaborators around money specifically. Okay, circulation, stockists, and distributors. Who buys books, and navigating the distribution process as well as expectations. Okay. In this list of things, this is by no means an exhaustive list. I just listed a few examples so that you could see, and I'm going to kind of point you to like how to find this information. So in here, some distributors who are outlined in 10 books and public knowledge books do distribution. Distribution is you can think of it like a middle person model where the distributor buys your book and then pays you 40% for that book. And I have that on another slide, and then distributes it to stockists. So there's a benefit, again, of visibility, but I think it's this question of, is that really worth it? Stockists are places like bookshops who purchase or consign books to sell in their bookstores. So Print and Matter was one of the last examples. Ulysses, we heard from G. Wesley last night from Ulysses, is another stockist. Quimby's in Chicago would be another one. Circulation is more like thinking through, where do books circulate? Granted, distributors and stockists are circulating artworks, circulating publications, but circulation in like a library, if we're thinking like library archivist practice, is usually through libraries. And so circulation could be in special collections. In academic institutions often have special collection libraries that collect small publications, as well as exhibitions. And I mention exhibitions because in the past couple of years, I've been in a few really great artist book, photo book, publication-based exhibitions, and that's becoming more common in this world. And so that's another layer for thinking about circulation through public presentation or through being contextualized in an exhibition. Okay, so this is from my actual press website. I want to point out, like, how do you figure out where people are doing this work? So when you start to learn about presses and publishers, I think it can be really helpful to just look at their info. So this is at the bottom of the Seaton Street Press website. It lists the stockists for the project, and everything is linked out. And that's not to say like every publisher is always going to do this on their website, but a lot of people do. And you can get a sense of, who's publishing and distributing where. So the stockists listed are all places where the books that I publish are stocked. And those stockists either bought wholesale or they consigned. It's a combination. Anymore, and because I've been doing it a little longer, I just start not doing consignment. I just kind of finally gave up with it because it's so difficult to get paid. If you sell wholesale, you get paid up front, and then that's just that. And they're going to distribute and sell your book whenever. Distribution, I have distribution within 10, which is based for EU and UK distribution. So places that I wouldn't easily be able to distribute publications. And I made that choice based on visibility for the artists. So those are some things, like if you go to a website, just look for that. Wholesale versus consignment. So visibility comes with a cost, and I just want to kind of explore what that cost looks like because it's different for everyone and may feel more worth it to some people than others. In the payout structure, so typically when you get paid for a wholesale item and you are selling for a distributor, so if we think about, like, if I go back to distributors, and 10 public knowledge would be good examples, I get to pay, and as the artist or publisher, I'm receiving 40% of retail value. A lot of people might be like, oh, that's not so good. But it is the kind of standard of what the distribution model looks like. And distribution is different than consignment, and it's also different from wholesale. So in that sense, like payout, you can kind of anticipate 10% goes to the distributor, 50% goes to the bookshop or the stockist. Some benefits of doing this model are that you get your work distributed domestically or internationally in places that maybe you don't have relationships with. So there could be a significant professional benefit. It's ideal for having circulation and having books acquired in collections. People that you don't currently know are going to encounter your work. But it, again, comes with a financial drawback. So the drawback being that it's lower rate of compensation. It's not the best for paying for production cost on a publication. So let's say that we'll just like as an example, we'll say you made an edition of 200 and one of these distributors approaches you and would like to distribute 50 copies. They are going to essentially consign those 50 copies, meaning you're going to send them to the distributor. You will not see payout for 6 months, even begin. And that's consignment. So that's assuming that bookshops have then purchased those books and you get paid out 6 months, usually after the first moment you've distributed the work. And then it's quarterly moving forward. So you can't count on distribution to pay for things, but you could count on it for, usually it's international visibility. So that's just something to think about. It also means that you need to have a larger edition size because most distributors are going to ask for something like 20 to 50 copies. It's more likely they're asking for 40 to 50. And so that is something to factor into it too. I didn't put the payout structure on consignment as it varies for places, but standard consignment payout is 50-50, where a bookseller would be paying you 50% of the retail cost. And a standard wholesale rate would be 50-50 or 60-40. So in really good wholesale environments where you're selling a publication directly to a stockist, so let's just pretend like I take my book to a place that buys books, like a bookshop, to sell, and I ask for a 60% wholesale as a small press and as a small publisher, they likely will say yes. But if you're a larger entity, they might say 50-50. But for small presses and for artists, generally like artist run spaces and artist driven spaces are going to honor a 60% wholesale rate and they're going to take 40% when they sell it. And that's ideal. But 50-50 is also kind of standard and okay. But that's still all much better than distribution, which distribution is the 40-60 and you're only getting the 40. So that's just something to think about where you sell work. Okay, so what alternatives do we have to this? Webshop as agency is really about encouraging people to distribute their own work through web platforms. It's great to run a web shop. There's minimal cost associated with managing an online shop. Usually you pay an annual fee, like an LMS, CMS, content management system, where you're paying someone to host your website and you have to pay a yearly fee. But if you're selling books regularly, it's probably going to be worth it. But the one thing is be prepared for shipping because you need to charge for shipping and also you need to deal with the reality that people expect things to come soon after they order them. So it's good to have an FAQ on your website. Like I have an FAQ for 1 to 2 weeks shipping and sometimes we're really back ordered and I have to write people to say it's going to be late. Web shops as personal agency give you the ability to develop and design whatever kind of web viewing experience you want for someone. So you can make something interactive, you can show videos, things that you click on can take you to different pages. You can really think through like, what is the experience of the press I'm running when someone comes to the web shop? And again, self-agency and being able to collect 100% of the proceeds of making a project, which allows you to make more books. And if I were thinking about it from like a self-sustaining practice, is really important to have a web shop. Okay, art books within art book fairs. So another place that you can distribute your work and sell your work is within art book fairs, specifically trying to be at fairs that are well attended because you will likely do well in sales if you're making a lot of publications. It's also the place where you find your community. And for anyone who's on the call in this community, it's really such an incredible space. So a ton of people, it's intense. It's usually like going to camp for several days. You're dealing with a lot all at once. A lot of times publishers are working on super frantic deadlines to get to that moment of exhibition, like public presentation. There's so much that goes on, but I think really grounded in a sense of community. So I just have a couple of documentation photos from past fairs. This is New York Art Book Fair 2022 fall, and a range of publications from that time, some of which are no longer in existence or sold out. And so just thinking through distribution, like how do you design and manage a project once you've made a bunch of books? So thinking like table design, table display, didactics, how do you communicate? It's in another slide, but I'll talk a bit about communications. But in this slide, I can sort of say in each publication, like I think you can probably see my mouse. In these areas, there's didactics that can be pulled from the book that include pricing and include publication details and a short description about the project, which I find are really helpful for selling books, but also just for the viewers who, don't really want to engage with you. They just want to look at the book. And there's lots of people like that at fairs. I might even be one of them, honestly. But I think just giving people information, allowing them to engage with it. Books do have a way of selling themselves. Like some people are really good at selling their books and they're going to talk to you and like make such an incredible story and bring something to life. And some people don't have that skill and that's not their preference. And so it's just finding that kind of authenticity within how does something like table display affect how your books circulate. In these spaces, so many people, like librarians, best spaces to meet librarians, they're going to come to exhibitions, like notable art book fairs. They're going to purchase, sometimes not on site. Sometimes they leave their business card for you, or sometimes they email you a week later and make an order. Sometimes they don't say anything and they just go to the web shop and they buy a bunch of your stock. But just being thoughtful about presentation and attention to detail goes a really long way, and trying to meet people and extend yourself and share information easily, like have either something related to your press, whether it be business cards or a QR code or something that people can get to where your information is. It's really important for these kinds of spaces. And then the community aspect of what we do in publishing, I think cannot be underscored enough. It's such a vibrant space to make real relationships with people that involves developing people's work. So this work is from Diana Guerra's project that we recently worked on, Fleeting Under Light. We had a launch at ICP's Photo Book Fest this past September. And these are just some like shot on film by another friend, and blurry, which, is fun for all the photographers. I think, but just thinking through like the sentiment and the kind of relationship of being with community, being with peers, and getting to celebrate publications, because you work really hard on making these things and then getting them out, circulating, distributing, launching, is a whole other process. And so just having moments where you can at least commemorate that a bit. And art book fairs tend to be the space for it, like book launches, but definitely the fairs. And then this is another fair also in September. Somehow we did 3 fairs in 1 month. Still feeling that. And this one is from Latinx Project La Feria, which we did as a smaller fair, but was super community driven. And so also for Diana's book, we were featuring this work there. And a lot of what I'm doing is within Latinx publishing. So like I primarily for that exhibition just featured those types of books. And it was really great, like in terms of expanding one's community, but also just like finding your people. Like the whole reason you make the books is to find the places that they're supposed to be. And that takes work, it takes effort, it takes time. And I think, the longer you publish, the more those relationships just organically emerge. It is a fluid community. It is not one in which there's not like a very clear hierarchical path. And I think that's part of what like brings people into these spaces, is that it's not just a ladder that you're like climbing, you're just building relationships and you have no idea where those relationships are going to go along the way. So that's like the unspoken, the real strategy to distro is like, just meet people, make the work, like find the things will find you. Okay, some things on communications. Some best practices and just other suggestions. So something that I think really matters, as much as many, not all, use social media, it's important to think about how social media can be a space that is so helpful in terms of you're building new relationships, you're going to connect with people, you're going to maybe make friends, who knows, but you don't want to make assumptions that publishers want to hear your book pitches on social media. So a general best practice is do not direct message a book pitch, like a publication pitch, unless a publisher has literally said like they're accepting them that way. there's a couple of things. One is that there is one aspect of social media, for those of you that are like advanced users, that direct messages, if you're not following someone in that world, you can't see them. So I can't even actually tell you how many times I've had like hidden messages, sometimes a year old, and you don't know that they're there. And so if you come back to them, like let's say you accidentally come to them, it could be a year later, and someone has pitched you a project, whether it's relevant to what you publish or not, like you haven't seen it. And by that point, it's pretty outdated. So one is like, it may not be seen. Two is that in terms of professionalism, it's generally just good practice to develop professional relationships over email and to send a PDF, like a book dummy, or to ask if you can submit a physical book dummy. Most publishers at this point don't take physical copies or dummies anymore. There's some book awards that do accept physical copy, and it's a requirement for certain book awards. But for like seeking publication and support from a publisher, you definitely would likely want to check their website and see if they accept publications. And then second to that, you'd want to make sure that they're the right kind of publisher for what you do. And then think about how to communicate with them. So that can work really well if you're in person. Another thing I didn't put in here, but I'll just say like as a part of distribution, generally it's frowned upon to show up to book fairs with book dummies and try to pitch a project on site. Most publishers don't like that because that's not like they're stuck. Think of it like the publisher is stuck behind the table. They can't leave. They're there to sell books. And if you come with a project and you're trying to like talk their ear off about the project, they may not respond positively to that. They may not say anything about it. Like they're maybe, you know, people aren't just mean, but I think that it's just generally respectable to reserve that kind of communication for email or for other avenues like open calls or open submissions when somebody is actually seeking publications. Really great spaces to send your work. So that's sort of the social media aspect. Press releases, I think, are so helpful to contextualizing a project. I will say, like, as I've scaled up my own press, I've been writing press releases pretty consistently, and I'm finding that it drastically alters where the work goes. So I had mentioned that Diana's work is traveling for a Latin American exhibition that will be in the EU and is based from a curator in Bogota. And that project, I sent the press release. We were able to send like a lot of good press images and was so well supported. And it's special that it gets to have those relationships, but like having the press release really helps because then if I need to share it with someone, I can just say like, here's the bio on the artist, here's a long form description of the work. Something to point out is that this description of Fleeting Under Light is longer than the one that I showed you in the first slides. And it's longer because it's meant to be a more narrative version of the text. So it gets into some of the historical backgrounds, the aspects of indigenous practices in Peru in terms of making anthotype from things like cabbage or beet. And it gives you more context than perhaps the short didactic does on the book table if it's at a book fair. So that's something to think about. Build a newsletter. I have been late to that world, but I have officially built a newsletter and I'm finding that a lot of people really want to be on the newsletter. Not because I don't even think whether it's what I do or not, like it's not that. It's just that people seem to like newsletters still for things that they're interested in. It's different than getting your news through Instagram, right? Like it's more narrative, it's longer sometimes, maybe it's more personal, but you can really embellish personality and authenticity within newsletters. And I think that's like a nice way to also share. I wouldn't send a press release through newsletter necessarily, but I might link out something when there's a launch or when there's a new release. And so it's just another model. Didactics, which I mentioned in the other slide, make things for people to read at book fairs so that it's easy for them to access the work. Descriptions that explain the project and pricing are usually work best. And I just have like two more for you. The last one, Books Are Living Archives, is really thinking about books as an ongoing conversation. And this quote from Ulysses Carrion, a book is a space-time sequence, really thinking about how books are containers and they hold space and time as this relationship that's continuously recontextualized, repositioned. And so in this, like in closing, just kind of thinking through like, what do books do? Books are really kept alive by their readers. So how readers associate their new associations that happen every time a book is in a new context. So you might be familiar with it, but it's coming to someone else differently. accidental discoveries happen. Things are read in and out of context, right? Especially when we don't have like the publisher, the artist present to talk about the work. Books continue to be felt, held, and interpreted in a myriad of ways. They're both precious and not. They're also quite intimate. And I think in a time and moment in space and culture in which intimacy is so fraught, books offer a different kind of experience. Its tactility is unique, but also its kind of closeness in terms of its relationship to a reader. The most important things I think I can sort of leave you with, and then we can talk about this a bit, is what is the experience you seek to share with your reader, and who are you making this for? And I think that as you get into publishing, it's really easy to get lost on those two because of all different kinds of competing concerns and conditions. And so at the end of the day, like you likely are here because you're an artist of some sort, and you have to remember what it is that you're making the work for and who that might be. Like that might change too. Like I can say like wholeheartedly, my publishing practice has changed a lot in the last 6 to 7 years. And who I was making the work for in the very beginning is not who I'm making the work for now. And that's important to acknowledge as your work changes and grows. A lot of times people get hung up on the logistics. Like the first slides I showed you, there's just so much to do all the time. It's really important to make your work and not let logistics stand in the way. I know that access to funding is usually the largest logistic of what can stand in the way of making books or publications or artwork in general. So trying to be scrappy about it and figuring it out, like however you get there, but just make sure that you make something, even if it's like note drawings on Post-its. You can't move forward with any of it if you don't have a form to begin with. And part of getting people to support your work is being able to physically produce something, and I think show something that they can get behind. So try to like stay grounded in that. And then the last part is just trust that books do find their right context. But you have to be in public spaces. It's really important to share the work. And I think without things like book fairs or community-driven spaces, all of what I'm presenting would be pretty irrelevant. Like it relies on those communities to be able to exist. So I think, Tyler, that is all from me.
Amazing. That was so wonderful and insightful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to stop my share. And I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you so much for this really, really informative and just enriching conversation. And I'm just curious what your favorite part of the publishing process is. I know it's kind of like a wide-ranging question, but as an artist who publishes, I'm curious what is the most, yeah, just what's the most satisfying part for you personally?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Working with artists, I think like number one, getting to collaborate with people I care about. I end up either becoming super close friends with everyone I've worked with and or already am. And I think it's that relationship of like true deep collaboration. We work on projects for 1 to 2 years on the books that I publish. So you can just imagine like when you spend that much time with someone and their work, you get to know them in a way that is different than just being friends with someone. And the ability to know someone's work that's not your personal work is pretty transformational, especially as a practicing artist, where I'm like, I see things differently because of that relationship, but also just the making. It's really fun to make them and to see, like, to dream up something and then to actually physically make it is still super inspiring to me.
Thank you.
Whoever does have questions, you can either unmute and you can also put it in the chat too if you'd prefer. I do have a question though. So I'm curious because I've noticed like some places, for example, like Printed Matter, will say that they require like a certain number of copies to be made in order to like accept submissions. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about like, yeah, I guess like how much time you spend researching like different stockists and places like where you foresee the work being to, because it of course like affects the production itself?
Yeah, that's such a good question too. I feel like, so I am bad at searching. Like I think what I just lectured on, I did. Like I made the things the way I wanted to make them, and then I dealt with the rest later, which is my general advice to artists, is to like just make it happen however you can. And I didn't care about any of that. And I felt like I had to like claw through, I still feel like I am like often clawing through spaces to like get a tiny bit of access to something. And that hasn't changed. But I never checked. And I generally don't look. Because the goal was never like must be distributed or sold, stocked by printed matter. Actually was a goal, I will say. Like I love printed matter, and complexities are aside, like I generally really value what they do. So I did want to be stocked there, but I think even an edition of 30 counted because they stocked some of my really early work at small edition numbers. So I don't think they have that big of a barrier on edition size. I think it's probably like an edition that's under maybe 20. I'd have to check the website. But I wouldn't fret about those parts. Like for everyone making, especially for this cohort, like I think the best recommendation is to just make it. Make the book dummy, try to prototype, make an edition of 10 or 20 or 30 or more. And if your goal is stockists, I would say you're not concerned about money, because stockist is not where you're going to make real money on publications. It just isn't, because you lose so much money in doing that kind of stockist versus like consignment versus wholesale model, that if you're looking to sell publications, it's in web shop, art book fairs, and honestly, those two primarily. Like stockists, it's great. Wholesale and consignment, great for visibility, not great for money. So I think if someone really, really wanted stockist aspects, they would have to look at their financial model for like, what are their goals? And then maybe they work backwards to determine like which websites say which amount and publish accordingly.
Thank you. It looks like someone asked in the chat, how is it working with artists and negotiating royalty rates as a small press publisher?
Great question. Yeah, it's tricky. I run on a model that is like kind of rare in that I pay for the publications upfront, like I produce the work, and then I give the artist 10 to 15% of the edition size. So if that's an edition of 30, that's like somewhere between 30 to 45 copies, or sorry, edition of 300. And then I pay back 50% of proceeds once publication costs have been met. So I can say like it changes for every publisher, but I have a pretty standard model where it's that fixed rate. I think based on production costs, I'm moving to 10% of the edition to say like I will give 10% of the edition and I will pay for the entire project, and then I will pay back 50% to the artist once proceeds have been met. So to me, it's not hard, but it's more like a lot of people don't have clear communication around what money looks like. And I find that as a publisher, you really need to be clear with artists, and there's no negotiating of those things. It's not like some artists can say, well, I want 70%. I would be like, well, maybe I'm not the right publisher. Right. So I think as an artist, I know that that model is equitable because so many are extremely exploitative. So it's more like, I think to the question that was asked, just define what your values are first, and then be firm in them and be clear in them when you work with artists.
Amazing. And someone else asked, is there a resource to see an example of a standard contract for publishing payout? And what things should a publisher be aware to protect themselves and the artist they are collaborating with?
Yeah, standard publishing payout. Okay, so Printed Matter has a consignment PDF, I believe, on their website that you can access. They also give it to you when you try to consign with them or wholesale with them. And it has all the standard information. That is the one that I use to inform what I built in terms of like the contract I would give for artists I was either doing distribution for early on, because I do a little bit of distribution under the press. Mostly it's just a publishing practice. But that was a helpful payout structure. It's paid out quarterly. And I have like a stipulation in mind where it's like I pay out artists after book fairs because there tends to be more proceeds after book fairs, but that's not a standard or norm in the practice for most people. I can see that what things should a publisher be aware to protect themselves? Honestly, I think this one's so tricky. It's really important to work with people you trust, who you have already built and established some kind of familiarity with. So I do studio visits with all artists before I ever extend an invitation to publish a project. And I refuse to do it without, in rare circumstances, because I found that if you don't spend some time with somebody, you don't really get to know like who they are. And you figure out your people by being with them. So I have found that like old school, like one-on-one relationships, collaborative relationships help me understand who I should and should not work with. And that is really like leading by intuition, I'd say, like as a protection strategy. And then also you can write a formal contract. That's more of like a legal protection strategy. But I'll admit that like I don't write those very often because I'm publishing to small enough scale that it hasn't been a need. And I'm also working with people that I really trust. But I think if you were looking for like a more litigious answer, is like you could look into the formalities of having like a legal protection in terms of representing other people's work. And one other protection of that would be filing LLC instead of sole proprietorship, which protects you more because you can't be at fault in the same way that you can as a sole proprietor.
Amazing. Someone else asked, they said, I'd like to hear a little more about how to make pre-orders work and how to sell and represent the idea before you have it in hand.
Yeah, great question. You kind of have to make the book dummy of whatever that object's going to be to pre-order it. So most publishers, like I can say, I have friends over with the folks who run For the Birds Trapped in Airports in Los Angeles, formerly Candor Arts. And they would be a really good model of that because they make very high-end small press publications, and they often are doing pre-order, pre-sale. And they make really nice book dummies first. And then from there, you could place an order and then it will, when it's done in production, will be shipped. So they actually, I will say like their peers and the, like colleagues and people that I look to like as I would say like peer aspirant. And that model for me, I started doing it because I was like, you know what, like I cannot afford to keep making so many publications without having funding up front. So if I do this model, it funds a project. So the project I showed you, Alcaide Ramirez's work, we funded it that way. And it is in production and it will be produced in the next 2 months and it's paid for. And we did it on the web shop and through an exhibition that he had in Southern California. It was a unique situation, and something maybe to this question that's important is to say, working with artists who have communities helps you pre-sale something. So if you know someone and you're like working collaboratively with them and they have a great community, most likely your pre-order is being fulfilled through the artist community, not always through the press. Like I can say for his work, 70% of funding came from his community directly. And I only probably pulled in 30% from me doing book fairs. Like I sold one in San Francisco, one at ICP, like individual situations. But compared to his, like most of the pre-orders came from his local community.
So the next question is one that I also have. So Saskia says, your talk was incredible. Thank you. Would you mind talking about your experience with design? Do you have any suggestions for visual artists who want to publish but don't have too much of a background with graphic design?
Yeah, that's a really important one. Okay, so I technically don't have much of a background in graphic design, but definitely am a designer at this point in life and I have a printmaking undergraduate degree, so I did get some design education there. But honestly, I learned design from looking. Like I'm a student forever and I'm constantly looking at design. So it's like I'll go to things like AIGA or I'll look at typographics, which is run through Cooper Union. There's all kinds of like typography conferences and design events and free education online. And if you're a student of that, like you can learn anything. So I spend a lot of time looking at the publications of other peers that I admire something about. I keep visual catalogs, I screenshot things, I take photos of everything. When I go to exhibitions, I read the wall didactics really closely. That's like part of what's informed my writing practice in terms of how I contextualize people's artwork, is thinking about curatorial practice and how do curators talk about artwork. And just being a student everywhere you go, like just take note, you know, when you go to the library, what are you drawn to? Learn about the difference between serif type, the type that has like the little feet, ornamental feet that come off the letter stems, versus sans serif. So it's just slab. Start to learn the terminology and learn what you gravitate toward, and try to keep like a catalog of why. So even if you're just writing it down in your phone notes, to be like, I liked that bold text because it felt like, it can be so rudimentary, but it will help you understand the graphic language and graphic identity of what you're responding to in real time, which is likely the most accessible way for you to learn about something that you're already visually experiencing all around you.
Okay, so someone else said, what kinds of things helped you scale up your press, and in what ways have you scaled since you started?
So thanks, Leah, for that question. I have a lot of different support. So I started really bare bones. I did not have funding for the project. It was self-funded and super scrappy, like publishing off of Risograph at a university that I taught at the time, buying the cheapest paper in limited runs. And yeah, it just really was not well funded. And I got an academic job in 2019, full-time academic job at Skidmore College, where I teach and have taught since. And I have grant funding internally. I also have research funding internally. So I am able to fund the project that I run through that kind of money, institutional money, where I will literally apply for things to get money. I will pay people. I can pay for labor more now than I ever could before. I didn't know that you went to Skidmore. That's lovely. So I definitely like have more institutional access than I used to. So it has allowed me to scale up the project. And if anyone on here like knows the early Seaton Street work, you can see that difference. It's actually not even hard to figure out. Like if you go on the website and you click through publications, you can likely, based on year and like quality, you'll notice that the photography has gotten better. The documentation is more streamlined, and the sort of graphic identity is becoming tighter as the press grows. And so all of that, the reason I talk about money a lot, also because I was asked to talk about distribution, which is like basically money. But part of why I talk about it a lot is because it's defined everything in my life. I mean, I think it defines most people, like if you're coming from working class, middle class backgrounds, like it defines everything. And it definitely has defined my ability to make larger additions. So as I've had more access to funds, I can scale up. I also work trade and trade labor and have different relationships where I'm able to say like, okay, this person is a photographer. I can do this for them. I'll risograph this thing for somebody and I'll trade them for documentation time. Or I'll go do book labor here and I'll trade for binding time. Or I'll go do this there. And I did that almost exclusively, and I still do that. But I did that really exclusively the first several years of the project. So in terms of scaling up, I think I got some momentum and I got a lot of support institutionally, as in like visibility in the last couple of years. And even just being invited to speak in this context, right? Like Center for Book Arts is a really respected institution in terms of book publishing. And so it changes, like as your visibility changes, your access to things change. And I think it's important to kind of name that because often it's invisible in what we do, but it's part of it. So like you can grow when you get access to more things. That's the whole point of the small press publishing cohort, is that it was grant funded to support people making this work and to provide mentorship. So it's a privilege to be on the other side of it. But I think in terms of like the scale of Seaton Street, and to Leah, to your question, like it's grown faster than I can keep up, and I need more money to hire people because I'm really running it like as a one person, and it's insane, the level of operation.
Okay, so another one is, do you ever collaborate with other bookmakers for more non-conventional book structures?
Yeah, so can the person who asked that elaborate, like what kind of collaboration and what kind of non-conventional?
Feel free to unmute too.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
So how can I articulate this? Like, let's say that you go to a fair and you come across another press that did something really cool, like maybe the paper. Um, how can I articulate? I'm trying to like come up with like some funky, like you just see this funky book that it's like it's obviously handmade, something that you'd probably see at the Center of Book Arts, and you know that you don't have the means to do that in-house or just go to a simple printer and staple it yourself. Have you ever collaborated with another bookmaker, like another peer or colleague, to help you produce maybe another small run of whatever concept that you have in your mind?
Yeah, that makes more sense. Yes. So I work with Conveyor Studio in New Jersey. Conveyor does a lot of printing for artists in the community. And they have done a lot of my finishing. So let's say like I've been doing this hardcover book, which is Smythe Sewn. It's a specific type of sewing that involves a machine that most artists and publishers aren't going to have in their studio. And so that part of the publication is done there. Or like they'll perfect bind things for me because I don't have access to do that in my personal studio. And so the finishing services or the, like you could say bindery services, or in other cases, like they've done foil stamping for projects I've worked on, they are my main support. And that has been incredible in terms of having really customized, like high quality materials that I can't do on my own. But in terms of things that are more like unconventional, I mean, technically they can make anything that's the non-conventional. But I think in terms of like working with someone, let's say like a paper marbler, I haven't yet, but it's not that I wouldn't. It's more like the projects, it hasn't emerged. But I did want to plug and kind of share, and I'm going to put it in the chat for you all because you're all interested in this world, and this is very related, is For the Birds Trapped in Airports just started this Means of Books network. So this link that's in the chat, and I am part of this network of peers and friends who are publishers, bookmakers, printers, all kinds of folks in this book laborer world who are thinking about how to sustain and help and share with one another. And so the purpose of it is to be collaborative, but it is also to recognize and acknowledge that book labor is very intense labor and that most of us don't just have access to everything. And so collaboration can be really key in terms of like how you might take a less conventional book object and transform it within a project. You might get networked and kind of like connected to somebody through a peer group.
Okay. We might have time for like one more question if anybody has.
I'm like, y'all ask such great questions.
Yeah, we had so many. Well, thank you so much for this talk, and thank you everybody for not only attending but also engaging so much and asking so many great questions. It makes it super fun. So we have 2 other lectures coming up for everybody here that is on our event page on our website. So I just sent a link in the chat. So definitely feel free to attend those as well. Same as this one, they are free to attend, but donations are definitely encouraged and welcomed. But yeah, thank you so much, Lindsay. This was really, really informative, and I think so many of us really gained a lot from this. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. And definitely everyone, if anyone has questions that come up, please reach out. You can get my email, I'm sure, through either Center for Book Arts or somewhere online, but I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, bye everybody.
Bye.